Good morning, everyone. My name is Lande Ajose, and I am the Vice President and Walter and Esther Hewlett Chair for Understanding California's Future and a Senior Fellow here at PPIC. Thank you for joining us today. PPIC is pleased to present this program featuring our very own California State Controller, Betty Yee. Before we jump in, I'd like to have a few housekeeping items for you. First, this is a part of PPIC's 2022 Speaker Series on California's Future. And as a public charity, PPIC does not take or support positions on any ballot measure or legislation, nor does it support, endorse, or oppose any political parties or candidates for public office. We'd very much like to thank our sponsors of the series for their underwriting support. These organizations are listed on your screen and listed on our website. This series is also funded by the PPIC Donor Circle and the PPIC Corporate Circle, groups of individuals and organizations whose contributions help to provide generous support. Please consider joining us as a sponsor or a donor so that we may continue to make programs like this possible and ensure that they're free to attend. More information is available at ppic.org. And finally, before we begin, if you have a question for Controller Yee, please send an email to the email address on the screen. That is ppiceventquestions@gmail.com. We'd appreciate it if you'd include your name and your organization along with your question. We anticipate having about 15 minutes at the end of the program to devote to those questions. And now, I would very much like to welcome our featured speaker, California State Controller, Betty Yee. Welcome.
Thank you, Lande. Really wonderful to join you today.
It's a delight to have you, and thank you so much for joining us and for your public service at this really critical time for our state and for the nation.
Thank you.
I thought I'd start by kind of a reflective question, which is really looking ahead, thinking about where California is poised to kind of turn the corner on the pandemic. What do you see as the most important economic challenge facing the state?
Thank you for the question, Lande. And I think this is something that certainly as a state level official, is a question that crosses our mind every day. And what I would say, the most important economic challenge is really understanding more each day about the vulnerability of our economy. Mm-hmm. But I would say, particularly after the pandemic, the fragility of our human capital. This is something that I think no one has been spared in terms of experiencing, whether you were a frontline worker, whether you were a caregiver, whether you were a small business owner, whether you're an employer, to just see that what has been happening with our precious human capital here in California really experienced a lot of stress and strain, and I would dare say even trauma during the pandemic that I think raised a lot of issues that still need to be addressed. And I'm not a behavioral health expert, but I do see a lot of just those challenges still lingering, among certainly my family, our neighbors, in our community. And for the economy, I think that is something that we are going to have to pay attention to if we truly are going to continue to value one of our most valuable assets, and that is, our human capital.
How should we be thinking about our human capital, California's labor market? Is it stronger or more fragile than it was at the beginning of the pandemic?
It's interesting because the recovery, certainly, which California drove for the country, we are seeing many of the jobs that were lost in the early part of the pandemic come back. About 90% of the jobs that we lost, the 22 million jobs across the nation, have come back. And I think we need to get more granular about that. Just what are these jobs? What are the conditions under which people are returning back to the workforce? We still see signs, I know, just on our main streets about worker shortages. And so there is this mismatch with respect to what we're seeing relative to the recovery and still what the needs are. And so I think really understanding what is driving certainly the recovery, but more importantly, what is driving the areas where we are seeing worker shortages and why people are not returning back to work they previously did.
It's interesting because the recovery has not, even though it's been very helpful for that 90%, It's
Yes.
also brought with it some strife. And I think especially about kind of the hardship of rising prices.
Yes.
Right now, I just saw on the news last night that the average price of gas in Los Angeles is now $6 a gallon.
Yes.
And people are concerned about inflation across, a range of household expenses, across a range of, even economic backgrounds.
Yes.
What do you think can be done to address the rising prices and to kind of support those households who are most affected by the inflation we're seeing?
Sure. No, and with anything like inflation, we're always going to see that those who are the most disproportionately affected have been those households that have been struggling for a very, very long time. I would say in some ways, when we look at inflation, you can even consider it kind of a regressive tax in some respects, because it does really affect our lower income households disproportionately. I think the thing to do here is we really have to, not just because we're responding to gas prices, but to look at longer term solutions about how we can support, many of those lower income households, particularly as it relates to things that will help support their fuller participation in the economy, that can help with respect to their earnings, and all the things that we know can really support workers more generally, whether it be education, whether it be the cost of healthcare, certainly the cost of childcare and the availability of childcare, to be sure that many of these workers are able to fully participate in the jobs that are going to be available to them. And so this goes beyond just the issue of inflation. It really is about the longer term commitment that we make to workers to be sure that they can weather both these anticipated and unanticipated events. With respect to inflation, I will say that this is a different type of inflation that we are experiencing today, very much driven by supply chain challenges globally. And so the demand, and we also see at the same time the Federal Reserve raising interest rates to try to quell some of that demand. And so hopefully bringing some of those prices down over time. But until that happens, we are going to continue to see many households struggling. And then I'm going to just say the E word because it's a word that's loaded, but I think it's very core to what we should be focused on, and that is equity. That for many of those households that are still struggling, they have been struggling chronically. It's where disinvestments where investments have not been made traditionally, and so to be very intentional about any kind of relief, any kind of initiatives that look at long-term support for these communities is very, very important.
Mm-hmm. With respect to those households in the pandemic, during its worst stages, the pandemic really put a human strain not only on individuals and families, but on our state programs, right?
Yes.
And on the programs that were really designed to support them. How well do you think California's safety net and other systems responded to the pandemic? Were we up to the task?
I would say in terms of intentionality, very much up to the task. I think in terms of delivery, with a lot of lessons learned about how we need to be much more nimble real time to get benefits and relief to Californians. Certainly the volume of what we had to deal with was a challenge. And I would say that was also true of much of the federal relief as well. So I think government generally is in a position of hopefully assessing just what we did well. To your question, I think the intention was definitely there. But in terms of the time that it took for benefits to be delivered, the time that it took for government just to stand up these programs because they are complex, and the volume with which we were working really presented some challenges that I hope we can learn from and begin to put the proper processes. As one of my lead staff in my office likes to say, it's people, technology, and processes, and all of those three really have to be addressed much more nimbly by government at all levels.
Mm-hmm. I'd love to just step back for a moment because I know, because I did a lot of research preparing for this talk with you, that what your office does, but I'm not sure everyone in California knows what exactly the state controller's job is and what role your office had during the pandemic. So could you just talk for a little bit about what is it that the state controller does, and how were you involved in really helping to support those programs that did respond to the pandemic circumstances?
Thank you for the question. Excuse me. What I would say with respect to the controller's office, so as the chief fiscal officer, I am responsible for essentially independent oversight of our state's finances, first and foremost. And as the only independent auditor for the state of California, my team is responsible for reviewing all funds that are dispersed by the state. We do about $49 million disbursements a year. And this was elevated this past year with the addition of the Golden State stimulus payments that our governor and legislature approved. So add 25% on top of that, and that was our workload for disbursements for the year. So we pay the bills for California, essentially. We also are responsible for issuing the financial reports about the state's financial conditions, our annual financial reports for the state. We are responsible for payroll for over 280,000 state employees and employees of the California State University system, and also have the opportunity and the privilege of administering our unclaimed property program, which in many states is administered by either the controller or the treasurer of the state. But probably unique to California is that the controller has a seat on over 70 different boards and commissions, not all of them active and at the same time, but many of them with jurisdiction, policy jurisdiction ranging from public pensions to tax policy to the management of our state lands to victims' compensation, and a whole host of financing authorities that really help in the areas of alternative transportation, energy, affordable housing, and just trying to help many of our areas of the state that can help bring some innovation into some of the problems that we're trying to solve in California.
Interesting. You mentioned the Golden State Stimulus Program, which was a state-based program, but during the pandemic, there was also a huge surge in federal payments. I think there was $28 billion from the American Rescue Plan, roughly $20 billion from the COVID Relief Act. Can you talk about how those funds were spent and in your view, if they were spent wisely?
Sure. So those funds, certainly at the federal level, at the state level, I do believe that those payments really did a lot in terms of helping individual Americans, individual Californians be able to weather this time during the pandemic, to be able to have resources to spend, to provide for their families, to keep many out of poverty, to look at being able to stay on top of paying rent. So I do think it served very much a purpose. Relief, I like to say relief is not a permanent solution. And so, but I do know that, and I think each of us know people in our neighborhoods and our communities who are still really trying to recover, from the pandemic and certainly the early impacts with respect to job losses and the like. So I do think the relief funds have served a purpose, and particularly for families with children. This was just really critical when many people had to make a choice about whether to continue work or to be home, with their children with remote learning. The other thing I would say with respect to the funds is, there were many pockets of relief, and so we had the stimulus payments, but we also had particular areas of focus of relief for small businesses, we had tax credits for children. We had a whole number of other areas of relief. But I think for this time really did serve a purpose. And as I said, kept a lot of people out of poverty. I think for how we were trying to help people stay in their homes and prevent being evicted. Some challenges in terms of standing up some of those programs because we have never really had relief for renters. And so how we were able to deliver those dollars to renters took a little bit of effort to identify. But that was really true at all levels, from the federal government to the state to the local level, about being sure that we were getting the money into the right hands of people who needed that relief. So again, as we look back on these programs, I shudder to think what would have happened if these dollars were not available. Mm-hmm. So I do think it meant a lot in terms of keeping our economy going, keeping households going, providing for the very basic of needs. And certainly as we are able to see what it meant for a lot of people to be able to get back into the workforce. But this gave them just that extra little relief to just help ease some of the burden so that they actually could go out and look for work and to be able to rejoin the workforce.
When you think about the scale of resources that was invested in relief, I'm wondering how that compares, in your view, to the way in which the state is able to invest resources that are committed to the state's future. Because, there's this dynamic tension, you think $50 billion that came to the state for relief, that is important. And yet, how do we think about all of the myriad of challenges that we face and what it means to prepare for the future of the state, the ongoing growth and development, the evolution of the state? Can you talk about where you see that happening in our state budget?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think our governor and legislature have been very, very focused on really understanding that we really are seeing a convergence of several different events happening. So the pandemic, obviously, continuing to deal with the challenge of hopefully decreasing challenge of the variant of the virus. We are looking at the early recession associated with the pandemic, but also just what it means with respect to just the future of work, which you and I have focused some time on more recently. We are looking at really this time of fairness and equity, really being at the forefront of what people are, I would say, having a bit of an uprising over. That this is a time of racial reckoning, reckoning with just longstanding inequities that have presented challenges to so many of our communities. And then also we are not spared in any part of the state now from the effects of climate change. We are sitting here today with unseasonably high temperatures that are about to come upon us. We are experiencing a drought that has been in the making for a long time. And so that's going to be affecting many of our economic sectors as well. With respect to the relief, I think naturally, and I don't know that any of us would do any differently, we are solving to the crisis of the day. And I think it's very, very difficult to, how you put those needs on hold and to give yourself the opportunity to look over the hood, if you will, at the future. But it's essential that we do. And so one of the things that I worry about, frankly, is we've had this pandemic with COVID-19. This probably will not be the last pandemic that we face as a state, certainly as a nation in the world. The impacts of climate change, I believe, will create other pandemics of sorts in the future. So what have we done to really prepare our public health infrastructure, for the future of those pandemics? What investments have we made, particularly in communities that we know were disproportionately affected by the COVID-19 pandemic in terms of access to healthcare? And if you consider public health to be the foundation of all healthcare, then we know that the impacts of climate change are going to have the same similar impacts with respect to those who are living with chronic health conditions, to those who are breathing the dirtiest of our air in the state, to those who have just the inability to be able to just access, just so many of the critical services that are going to address some of these needs. So food security, safe drinking water, all of these things that are going to be affected by climate change are going to be right here staring us in front of us, throughout the state. So I think if those investments in our public health infrastructure with some of the relief monies that we have received, we could be doing more. We could be doing more, particularly in our disproportionately affected communities.
You mentioned this issue of investments and kind of how we think about allocating the state's resources. It actually reminds me that you, in 2 of those 70 boards that you sit on, actually include CalPERS and CalSTRS.
Yeah.
Which I think represents maybe 800 billion in
just about
investment.
Yes.
It's been suggested, and I'm curious to get your sense of this, that those retirement funds should potentially divest from Russian assets. And can you talk a little bit about your views on this question of divestment?
Sure. So let me just say, neither fund, and I think for anybody throughout the country that have made announcements about divesting from Russia holdings, no one is making new investments in Russia, so that is kind of a given. With respect to existing holdings, both pension funds, I think, have been very, very good, just as part of managing the portfolio, of working with our investment managers to look at how we minimize our exposure. My role as a fiduciary, along with my colleagues on both boards, is to be sure that we have the resources to pay the benefits to our retirees and beneficiaries. And when I look at the issue of divestment, there are always unintended consequences with respect to divesting. And I'll talk about that in a moment. But I think this idea that, yes, we want to do our part in terms of, what Russia has created in terms of this, war that I know that everyone has just spoken, really eloquently about, that this has more implications than just about Russia versus Ukraine, that what does this mean for our future? And for me, the regular rebalancing of the portfolio at both funds by our investment team already has reduced the number of holdings that we have in Russia. So that's just the natural work that we do when the market signals to us that this is what we need to do. The sanctions that were issued, the market responded to. And so I think this is where we looked at just exercising our diligence with respect to where our investments need to be during this time. For a long time, actually for some time during these past few weeks, we couldn't even trade because many of the financial networks were closed. And so were we going to have a fire sale on those assets and likely have these assets land back into the hands of the Russian oligarchs? Absolutely not. And so I think, for the remaining assets, we're in a wait and see mode, but we have actually reduced our holdings just by virtue of the regular rebalancing that we do when we take signals from the market.
Mm. Is that strategy around kind of reducing holdings the same approach that has been taken when it comes to divesting from fossil fuels?
For fossil fuels, we have both funds have looked at really reaching net zero in our portfolio in very, very different ways. But both funds are very engaged globally on how we reach net zero. We look at our portfolio, we integrate climate risk across all of our asset classes. We look at where there are new investment opportunities, but we also, as part of the strategy, continue to look at engaging our companies to be sure that they are helping with the transition. Both funds are part of a global engagement strategy called Climate Action 100 Plus that looks at 167 of our largest emitters around the world, and about 111 of those now have are committing to net zero pledges. And if seen to fruition by 2050, could actually see us reducing our greenhouse gas emissions equivalent to what China emits on an annual basis. So this work has to be done globally. We're not an island at CalPERS or CalSTRS, and so to be able to join other global investors and insisting upon this transition, and more importantly, the Securities and Exchange Commission this week issuing a draft rule on more robust climate risk disclosure by companies is going to help investors be able to make more informed decisions about where we need to place our assets.
Great, that's very helpful. I'd love to talk a little bit personally about you. You have had a deep interest in really lifting up the perspectives of those who are left out of policy discussions. And I'm really curious to know where that commitment came from.
Sure. I think it really has to do with what I call my origin story, Lande. I'm a daughter of immigrants, and growing up in San Francisco on the West Side, my parents owned and operated a laundry and dry cleaning business for 30 years. Not being very fluent in English. They both came from China with very little education. And of course, with any family business, and certainly a really common immigrant story, the children are the best employees because this is what is expected of us, to help with the family business. And I think what I would consider my role in the family business was not only to be someone who translated for my parents, but I was their advocate. Mm-hmm. And I think about so many communities and members of our community who don't have, an advocate for them. And when I think about just all of the challenges that we're facing as a state, my goodness, how wonderful it would be to be sure that the voices of those who are facing the most dire impacts of those challenges, could be at the table to talk about what their lived experiences are, to talk about what they believe solutions could be that would work to improve upon their conditions. And that is something that I feel very seriously about. As I have traveled the state, I have found just tremendous optimism and hope in the resilience of our people. And it's what gives me hope that there is no single issue that we are facing in California that we can't solve right here in California if we allow all voices to be at the table to help inform the solutions.
What kind of things do you think we can do to broaden the range of voices that kind of participate in those policy discussions in the state?
We have, and I think this is something the current administration, our legislature understands, certainly from the pandemic, that, to meet people where they are, right? I mean, you think about the role of government and how, we are delivering a lot of services. We're delivering this relief now during this critical time. And yet I do sometimes wonder, when all is said and done, has it really made a difference, for the long term? It is a question mark in my mind. I think it's made a difference in real time, current time, but hasn't made a difference in the long term. And I think we missed an opportunity in terms of inviting just members of our communities to come forth to say, just what would we do with this infusion of resources that could help us vision a future for how we can really hopefully be in a community that can establish and create our own resilience, that can help us in terms of thinking about a future where the effects of the pandemic will not be so dire in the future. That can hopefully elevate leadership within these communities so that we have represented voices from these communities over the long term. And then I think more importantly, how do we help build opportunities in these communities? That this should not be, I hope, this is not about government trying to dictate solutions, but that the solutions really are not a one size fits all. And that we have the opportunity, we have, I think, the tremendous privilege of using our diversity as our strength, and how that can inform public policy in terms of what works for different communities around the state.
Mm-hmm. Well, as you know, a lot of PPIC's research has really underscored how economic downturns, how even their recoveries can actually exacerbate income inequality.
That's right.
And it's actually one of the issues that we were trying to speak to when we took on the idea of the future of work. So I'm wondering, when you think about the long term, what are the kinds of things that we can do to narrow that income inequality divide, and what does that have to do with labor markets and the future of work?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think there has to be a worker-centric orientation to how we move forward. This is something that, as I started out, when you asked me the question, Lande, about what's the most serious economic challenge that we face, and I do think we're working differently now. So the process by which we conduct our work has changed. We have more technological tools that are at our availability now, and that has certainly changed the way in which we worked. But I do think the real focus on workers still has to be front and center. And by that, I mean, I think the nature of work has changed such that we are not looking at people being in jobs for decades now in terms of a career, that the demands and certainly the jobs of the future are going to be ones that require workers to be really skills ready, that will require probably some more mobility. Even though we can work in a virtual space, I do think being able to work in different types of spaces and certainly different locations, that's the mobility of work. And then looking at how we are valuing not just skills. I don't think this is just a reskilling issue. I do think it has a lot to do with workplace culture and values and just some of the things that I know of people who are choosing to stay out of the workforce for a little while longer because they're looking for a sense of purpose. And so what does that mean? And really kind of getting a better feel for what that means. And I'm going to relate this to something that may seem unfair, but I do think it is related. And that is, I do believe, and I see this in my own family, the reason why people are questioning this issue of, what purpose is my work really creating for myself and for those whom I'm serving, has become an issue because there's been a lot of, I think, consciously or unconsciously, I think just a lot of individual self-reflection, self-evaluation going on during this period about how we're being valued or how we value ourselves, because people have been so stressed. The lines have been blurred between personal and professional lives during these past 2 years. And so when we think about people returning to work, there's been a whole experience that I don't know that public policy is able to capture at this point in time, that we need to really try to understand better. That is about how we can support workers in a more mobile environment, in a much more ever-changing environment, such that we have to probably rethink our public programs for how we support workers, so that maybe unemployment becomes a place where we look at how we continue to have workers earn while learning, to look at how we apply perhaps the apprenticeship model to other types of work. So I think this is a great time for experimentation because as much as these problems are challenging us, we are seeing, I think, some models that are working locally that at least give me hope that people are really focused on these types of questions. And so while we really are going to stay in tune with the skills that are needed for the future of work, I also think that there's kind of this whole series of intangibles that we have to, get our arms around as well.
So that's really an interesting reflection, because one of the policy proposals that you well know has been discussed and debated in California is the role of guaranteed basic income.
Yes.
I'm wondering where you stand on that as a potential policy that could help to think about, as we encounter new forms of work, as we think about the shifting labor market, as we think about the evolving contract between employers and workers, whether or not there's a new institutional form, a new set of policies, regulations, laws that we need, and whether guaranteed basic income might be one of those.
I think there is a place for guaranteed basic income, certainly with respect to some of the challenges I just named. As we see workers, really transitioning, from work opportunity to the next, a guaranteed basic income may be helpful in terms of that support that they need during that transition period. For many who are actually trying to elevate their livelihoods and working conditions, guaranteed basic income has allowed them to be able just to have breathing room and take a day off to be able to go to a job interview when they don't have leave at work. And so I think this is I think the first thing about guaranteed basic income we have to do is just to kind of shed some of the myths around that, because I do think there is a role for that concept to play, given just the evolution of work that we are going to see before us in this next period of time. And I do think some great results will come out of just a lot of experimentation, and pilots that are being run. Los Angeles County being the most recent one, certainly the city of Stockton, but throughout our country, we're seeing just a lot more focus on this. And I do think this is something that could be a concept that is in recognition of what workers are having to face now, given that they are not, and we saw this during COVID. No one should have to make the choice of whether to stay home and be safe or to report to work.
That's right.
I mean, I think that is just that's a terrible choice for any worker to have to make. We also know that for many, working multiple jobs is the only way they're going to make it. And that for any worker to be able to think about transitioning to where one job is enough, they have to have the ability to be flexible. They need the flexibility to be able to even go back to school, go back and look at how to gain new skills. But more importantly, just the simple thing of being able to have time away from work to focus on how to do that for themselves.
One sector that was really highlighted during the pandemic was, in some ways, the fragility of our care economy.
Yes.
And I know you think deeply about issues related to the care economy. What are the kinds of innovations, what are the kinds of policies that need to be in place to really support a much more robust and vibrant care economy?
Yeah, this is very important, Lande, and this is very personal to me with my 98-year-old mother, and I share caregiving with my sisters for her. And it's an honor to do so. First of all, my hat is off to everyone who works in this care sector. It is tough work. It is work that is so essential in terms of the ability for our economy to work. It is so foundational to the functioning of our economy, whether it's childcare all the way up to elder care for people with special needs. It is one where I do believe it's so foundational that we do have to look at how do we really value the workers in the sector for who they are. The type of work that they do, the tools that they need to do the work well, how we can elevate the quality of care that they are providing. So bringing in technology, bringing in all the tools and resources to help elevate quality of care, that then also begins to, what I would say, enhance the type of work that many of the workers in the sector do. It's not a coincidence that this is a low-wage sector of our economy. It's also not a coincidence that much of this work is carried out by women, people of color, many immigrants. And when we think about that, it is allowing many workers to be able to fully participate in the workforce themselves. because family care is uncompensated care, creates a lot of stress, creates a lot of financial pressures. And for so many, that is the choice. That's the only choice they have. So we need to really elevate the sector to where we know that this is not just about providing relief to the workers, but this is about how do we really value the work that they do for what it is and for the purpose that it serves in our overall economy.
Mhm, mhm. Thank you for that. You mentioned a couple times that there is an opportunity emerging from the pandemic, really across all kinds of institutions, right? Government, business, education,
Yes.
and community organizations, to think about how we do what we do in new ways. And I'm wondering what kinds of innovations you've seen that you think ought to continue beyond COVID. Where should we be leaning in?
Absolutely. Well, first, let me just say I'm a proponent of remote work, but in a hybrid model. I do think the human interaction is still very, very important. But I also think that what Californians and really the rest of the nation were thrust with during the pandemic is that technology is going to be part of our everyday lives. And whether it's about how we learn, how we work, how we communicate, this is going to be a part of our everyday life. And so I do hope that part of the innovation going forward is looking at how we deal with issues of tech equity, that we, again, that issue of equity is such that we are looking at the future with respect to how our investments and how we work, how we learn, how we communicate, how we interact with one another is going to be such that everyone has access to the tools to be able to do that well. So I do think that the innovations that we see here are in some ways what we see relative to some of our emerging economies around the world. I part of serving on the pension boards is that we do have the opportunity to kind of take a look at what our emerging markets are doing. And in so many ways, because they are now having to build economies to the reality of today, they're dealing with issues of tech equity right at the forefront. They're dealing with issues of access to healthcare right at the forefront. They're dealing with issues of gender equity right at the forefront. And so we're kind of doing this, a little behind, but it's also the time to think about future investments really tackling that issue so that this is not about catch up. It's about everyone really kind of being on a level playing field. So I do think that, and actually the interesting part about this, Lande, is that technology actually is the answer to this. And so as much as it's not going to replace workers, I'm sorry, we're not at that point. In fact, it's going to elevate the work that we are all going to be doing. And I do believe that it's going to elevate the availability of our human talent that will be available, because I look at the diversity in our state and who best serves, so many of our diverse communities will be the members of those communities themselves. And so how do we build kind of, workforce initiatives around that? How do we look at the institutions in those communities that can help us elevate that, whether it's our community development financial institutions or our minority depository institutions, and really just elevating that. I mean, I think that we have the tool, the institutions are there. I think it needs a major refresh, and I think technology is a big part of that.
Great. Well, we're going to transition to the audience Q&A shortly. As a reminder to our audience, please submit your questions to PPIC eventquestions@gmail.com. But before we turn over to the audience, I want to ask you another question, which is, you mentioned earlier that one of the responsibilities of the Controller's Office is to really think about this issue of the accountability of state resources, the allocation of those resources in many ways to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse, or at least to detect it very early on.
Yes.
I'd let you're termed out at the end of this year, and I'm wondering if you feel like your office is well set up to do that, or what advice you would have for your successor to make sure that the Controller's Office is better able to deliver on that goal.
Yeah, thank you. I believe we are well equipped, really just because of the vantage point from which we do our work. We have just reach across all of state government. We see a lot. Very proud of my team in the audit division, and who have, since I've been controller, have identified about $7 billion in public funds that have been directed to unallowed uses. And so that is something that we always keep an eye out for. And it's not all waste, fraud, and abuse. Sometimes it's just, I would say also the capacity of our departments and our local governments to be able to do this work with strong internal controls. And so that is something that we will continue to identify. I think for us also, I am a big believer that government always has to be in the position of doing better. We are really at the highest level of delivering services for people. And I know we take our role very seriously in the State Controller's Office with identifying areas where we can become more efficient, identifying areas where we can really honor the precious taxpayer dollars that are here to serve all of our needs. And we know they're not always going to be plentiful resources. So we want to be sure that we are investing them and directing them in the most purposeful way. One of the areas that I haven't talked a lot about, and it's something that I do want to mention before we go into Q&A, and that is the issue of housing affordability in California, which is a major driver with respect to the fragility of our human capital that I talked about at the beginning. For so many, affordable housing is out of reach in California, and we as a state have to do better. And I want to applaud this administration and the legislature because we have historic investments in housing today in California, but we also have historic levels of homelessness. And we as a state have to do better in terms of how we administer our programs. We have housing finance programs that span across at least four different agencies, and to be able to consolidate that so that we can see what we are getting relative to the public benefit from each dollar that goes out for affordable housing is very, very important. And it is the one issue that I remember years ago, many of our bond rating agencies really wanted to keep a watchful eye on, that for any economic recovery to really be sustained, the housing affordability had to be addressed in a comprehensive way. So not only just in terms of housing construction, but looking at certainly housing for renters. We have close to half of our Californians who are renters. So our multifamily housing, looking at workforce housing. We also know that for many of our housing insecure now in California, many of them are just a step away from becoming homeless. And so it's become such a comprehensive issue, and it is probably the most important economic issue. We ask people to stay sheltered in place during the pandemic, and for many that was very, very challenging because of their inability to be able to still pay their rents and to stay in place in their homes during that period of time. So just a lot of vulnerabilities around housing, and it is something that I think we definitely have to be much more intentional about, and that we have to do our part to be sure that our house is in order as a state administering a lot of these programs that can cut the time between the approval of a project to breaking ground at a project and hopefully getting these housing units built much more efficiently and timely.
So one of the issues related to housing that's really been in the news is Sequa. Yes. And that, perhaps Sequa was, an initiative gone wrong, that somehow, despite its aspirations, that it actually has impinged upon our ability to produce housing at the rate at which we'd like to. Can you talk about the ways in which you think we have created barriers within government, perhaps, unintentionally, that have gotten in the way of our ability to really kind of produce the housing that we need for all of our residents?
Sure, absolutely. Sequa is interesting because I think all of us really feel very proud that we are here in California, where we place a lot of emphasis on protecting and preserving our natural resources and our environment. On the other hand, when we look at housing development, Sequa has also been something that has been, frankly, a weapon on all sides. Whether it's a developer looking at, a developer now having to essentially add a line item for Sequa litigation, knowing that this is something that could be the basis of a challenge on a development. Looking at Sequa as the genesis of a lot of the NIMBYism, that is coming up relative to why certain areas of the state are never going to be open to building more units of housing. Sequa has served its purpose. It is several decades old, and I always think it's great to refresh, some of these laws to be much more relevant for today. And I would say today, given the effects of climate change, I would like Sequa actually to pay attention to some of the back end issues about the sustainability of what we're building. looking at being sure that what we are building can withstand just some of the the impacts of climate change that we are experiencing real time today. The other areas that I think really have, and this is well-intentioned, but always gets in the way, and that is we become really enamored with programs that help certain populations, and I'm just as guilty of that. I like the fact that we are providing housing for our veteran population. I like the fact that we are providing housing for our special needs population. I like the fact that California is just open in terms of just really embracing that diversity. But when we have all of these programs working in silo, next to each other, it's not helpful with respect to efficiency. Certainly not helpful with respect to the best expenditure of funds for the greatest broader public benefit. And so I think we have to look at how we do better as a government to be sure that we are just streamlining as much of that as possible so that the dollars actually go towards building more units and more units in the most efficient and timely manner.
Great. So we do have some questions that have come in from the audience that I want to make sure to share with you. Question number one comes from Ellen, who is at Merced Community and Labor Center. And she asks, how do you think we should deal with the unequal economic impact of COVID on low-wage immigrant workers and the disparate impact on different regions of California, such as the Central Valley?
Yeah. When we talk about economic development and economic growth, I always feel that these areas, and thank you for joining us from Merced, this is always the thing that I marvel at. And that is, when I travel to these parts of the state, I can tell you, and I think all of us know this, but the heart and grit of people who live in these areas to just wake up every day and just be able to, just deal with the challenges of everyday living and still be able to provide, for their families is just nothing short of remarkable. And we know some of the challenges that are happening in the Central Valley today, particularly as it relates to the drought and some of the economic impacts. And I think we have to be just very, very intentional about where we direct resources. And I know that as we direct resources to many of these areas that have been disproportionately affected, we're going to get a return there. We're going to get a return when we talk about how do we help these communities build resiliency. How are we going to help these communities look at being a part of being beneficiaries of future economic opportunities? I'll just give you an example. I think about the Central Valley. I think about the Inland Empire. When we talk about our water challenges here in California, where are the water jobs, that should be helping us, get through this drought? When we talk about water technology, why is it coming from Silicon Valley and not from these areas that really are the most severely affected? And so, how do we look at economic opportunity, economic growth, and new sectors of the economy that really can be driven by these areas that have felt these impacts and that can inform, just some of the solutions that really can help elevate the living conditions in these regions. So I would say intentionality, the direction of fiscal and financial resources, and then more importantly, because a lot of this will mean that we want to provide some technical assistance to these areas as well, because they've not had the experience of dealing with public sector funding or financing, and so we as a government have to be open to that. And so I think a different way of how we engage with these communities to be sure that part of how we build resilience is also the knowledge transfer of how we be sure that they are going to continue to look at how to not only just build that leadership and capacity on their own, but that their ongoing engagement with government will be such that we're learning from them as much as they're benefiting from what we have to offer.
Excellent. Thank you. Let's see. Our second question is from Grace Getty, a reporter with Cal Matters, who says several proposals have been made to help Californians handle the rising costs of gas and goods in recent weeks. Some lawmakers have proposed temporarily cutting the gas tax, while others have proposed one-time rebates ranging from $200 to $400 per filer. What's the best policy mechanism for helping people with increased prices? Are the proposals that are out there getting scaled correctly to the problem?
We were just meeting on this in my office. We issue the checks, and so we care a lot about this, that the policy is clear and that we know precisely who will be receiving the benefit. I will say this, I am not a proponent of cutting the gas tax. This helps fund our roads and highways. And so we know that anytime there is a proposal to cut that, we are going to be experiencing a backlog with respect to the improvements that need to be made on that front. So I am not a proponent of that. I do think that people's pocketbooks are hurting. And so we do need to provide some relief. How broad should it be? How targeted should it be? I think it really depends on, just are we able to just identify, and get that data that helps us identify, those who are the most severely affected by high gas prices. And we've been working with the administration on trying to fine tune some proposals. I know the legislature just proposed something last week as well. The policy, I would say, yes, it's up to the legislature and the governor, but from my perspective, it really should be targeted such that we know who we are issuing the benefit to, and that hopefully it is to a population that is going to feel the most relief because they are so burdened already. I will just say we learned from the Golden State Stimulus Program of the last year that there were some people who fell between the cracks because they did not have engagement with our tax system. They didn't, maybe weren't eligible for the California Earned Income Tax Credit, maybe didn't have an AGI that was met the criteria for the second Golden State stimulus payments. Many people who have lived with disabilities were not recipients of Golden State stimulus payments on SSI recipients. So I think if we can target that and have confidence about being able to identify that population, I think that makes a lot of sense because these are our California neighbors in need.
Great. Another audience question. Federal lawmakers are considering additional ways to invest in states and communities. What do you think California and other states need the most from our federal leaders right now?
Oh, thank you. We haven't talked a lot about education, but I do want to put some focus on education. I think about our institutions a lot, Lande, in terms of our healthcare systems, our schools, certainly our government. And I just think that one of the things that I have felt, and certainly my office has felt during this time, is that I think there's been a renewed appreciation for government and our role during this time. The idea that we were able to move much more quickly than during the Great Recession of 2008, particularly at the federal level with relief. That California, with the additional revenue that we realized, that we were able to push relief out the door as well. And on top of that, really, I think, gave the public a better sense of the role of government. So I do appreciate that. And so I do think that what needs to happen going forward is, for our public educational institutions, for our hospitals, our public health system, these all have to be just at the ready to meet the need at any time. And so while we're dealing with a more immediate crisis of how we're going to get people back to work, how we're going to get small businesses to reopen, how we're going to get our schools to really be safe environments again for our students to return back to school full time, our teachers, I do think there has to be what I call kind of the over the hood look in terms of the future. How do we really help these institutions be able to be more nimble, to really be able to respond in short order when we see the next crisis, and it could be a disaster like a wildfire, it could be another pandemic, but our own resiliency with respect to being able to respond to the needs of so many. And the volume is really a challenge. It's a challenge. I was very, very happy to see the investment in broadband, both from the federal government and for the state. To be able to close that gap is huge. I mean, just really huge in California. Kind of illogical to think that here we are the home of innovation and of Silicon Valley, and yet we still have these issues in so many parts of our state. So that I think is a significant investment, but I think really standing up our institutions to where we have the ability to what I call future-proofing our institutions. How's that? So that for anything planned, unplanned events, that we are at the ready to respond and really be there to help our most vulnerable.
I'm just a quick follow-up question on that. When you think about future-proofing our institutions, we have for 60 plus years had a master plan on education. The state has now come up with a master plan on early learning. When you think about future-proofing, are master plans the way to go? Like, how do you do that in the context of state government, state agencies, that entire bureaucracy, such that it can be both dynamic, but also have kind of a true north?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, Lande. I've had this dream, and I'll share this dream, and that is, I think about the future of work, and oftentimes when you think about the future of work in government, that's kind of the last thing you think about. But I do have this thought that, the role of government and how we actually deliver services will need to look very, very different going forward. Certainly, our ability to work remotely, the great pivot that many of us did in terms of how we work right shortly after the pandemic, suggests to me that this is possible. And that is, how do we in some ways decentralize our government institutions so that, the idea that state government is going to be run out of high-rise buildings in Sacramento or our urban areas just becomes a thing of the past. How can we actually have a workforce that is in our communities that actually can be there real time to serve the needs of people, and that have the ability to develop even our state workforce, in all parts of our state. We have these really wonderfully distinct regions that have such attributes about them that suggest to me that there's so much more that we can do, that a government can do in these regions to elevate where we started, our human capital, through our educational institutions, certainly through just many of our public institutions. And I think part of that is how do we look at developing that in a way where every community is touched and every community knows that their government is there, right there when they need us.
That's great. So we're going to end our program shortly. And the question, because my role here at PPIC is focused on the future, I'm just mindful that the last few years have just been deeply challenging.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, as you look to the future, as you think about California, as you think about what lies before us, what gives you hope?
I will tell you that we've spoken a lot about human capital today. What gives me hope always is the people of California. I have seen, I think we all have seen what has happened during these past 2 years. And as much as the challenges have been daunting and beyond daunting for so many of our communities, we also have seen the resourcefulness, yes, the resilience too, in some parts of the state, the innovation, and the just grit and wherewithal to kind of tackle, just what we have to meet every day. And I particularly just want to give a shout out to those areas of California that frankly government has neglected. You don't get a lot from us, but I know, I've seen firsthand when I've been in your communities, how you wake up every day, how you look at just how to make the day work for you. We know that during the COVID pandemic, we saw many families, and I saw this in the Central Valley, where children had to do remote learning and also have to be caregivers at home because both parents had to work multiple jobs. I look at that, and at the same time that I think about how that should not be the case, that one job for a wage earner should be enough in a household, but that very issue of just doing what has to be done gives me hope. It suggests to me that we're all in this together. And if there's any lesson that coming out of this pandemic that I hope we learn, and I think this is true for all of us, and I dare say I don't think any of us has escaped this during this pandemic, I think the lesson that we've all learned is that each of us is essential to the other. That we can't be isolated and think that things are going to change. That, there's an engagement, there's a connection, there is a dream. There's a dream that certainly under this administration, a California for all, that we're all working towards. And maybe that just needs to start very, very locally. But that is really, I think, what we have to be ambitious about is that, we look at just what is there already. This is a state that's known worldwide for our innovation. I know it's appreciated for its diversity, but more importantly, you put that all together with the experiences that all of us have had during this time, and even before the COVID pandemic, and the grit and the heart and just the strength of our people, I think really gives me hope that, as I said, there's no challenge in California that can't be solved by the talent and the brains and the grit of Californians.
Controller Yi, your grit, your heart give me hope. I want to just say thank you so much for taking time to share with all of our audience and with me your experiences, your views, and your leadership of this tremendous state. And just to say, California would be nowhere if we didn't have public servants like you who were willing to step into the fray and really, over many years, commit themselves to improving the state. So thank you for taking the time today, and thank you for your contributions.
Thank you, Lande. It's been a pleasure to really have this conversation, and it is my privilege to serve. Thank you.
Thank you. I would also like to take some time to thank our sponsors again, and finally to thank all of you for joining us today online. I hope you'll join us again next week, actually, when we'll have 2 more events in this mini series focusing on the lessons learned from the pandemic. On Tuesday, I'll be in conversation with State Superintendent of Public Instruction, Tony Thurman. And on Wednesday, I'll be talking to Michael Tubbs, the founder of End Poverty in California and the former mayor of Stockton. Finally, if you pre-registered for today's event, later today you'll receive a survey from us, and we'll hope you'll take a couple of minutes to fill it out and let us know how we did. From me to all of you, thank you once again for joining us. Please be safe and have a great day.